Hi folks, I'm Derek Olson, a biblical scholar with a love for the liturgy. Welcome to a Liturgical Look Forward for the week of Proper 7 in Year 2 of the Daily Office Lectionary. Each week we look at the scripture readings that are appointed for morning and evening prayer from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, which are the same readings that you'll find in the popular Forward Day by Day devotional, which is put out by Forward Movement. In addition to talking about the week of Proper 7, we're also going to discuss the feast of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist, which usually falls in or around this week. So we're going to touch on that briefly here right by the end. So, if we take a look at our first reading, we are still in the book of Numbers. We've been in Numbers for a couple of weeks now. Right now, we're sort of heading towards the middle point here. So we're finishing up the rebellion and death in the wilderness section. So again, Numbers is an interesting combination of narrative and legal material. Generally speaking, the narrative is going to set the stage for the laws that are going to follow. So most of the gaps that we'll see this week are because we're skipping the legal material. We're keeping the narrative and skipping the law part. So on Sunday, the first invasion of Canaan fails because God was not with the people. Then we skip over some material on offerings that culminates with a guy getting stoned to death for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. All right, then we're going to spend 4 days on a block of material around Levites and priests and their respective roles in worship. So priests were the ones who offered the sacrifices. The Levites were the liturgical helpers, often the musicians, but they didn't have a priestly role. In the early medieval period, and in subsequent Christian interpretation, the Aaronic priests of the children of Israel were equated with Christian priests, while the Levites were equated with deacons. So that gives you some sense of the separation of roles, but clearly it's not a one-to-one correspondence by any means. However, in this narrative, we see some Levites and some leaders of the congregation as a whole banding together and trying to offer sacrifice like the priests do, with some very bad consequences. Then we've got gap with chapters 18 and 19. We're going to skip legislation that talks about the distinctive roles of priests and Levites and which sacrificial portions go to which group. And finally, at the end of the week, we're going to hear about the rebellion of the people at the waters of Meribah, and their response gets Moses and Aaron kicked out of the promised land, and then Aaron dies. So really, we're kind of hitting the low point for the people of Israel in the book of Numbers at this point. Things will change next week, but right now we're sort of at rock bottom for Israel. All right, let's move on to our second readings. For our second readings, we are continuing through the book of Romans. What we're reading this week is we're heading into the righteousness and justification chapter. We're sort of hitting the end of 3, and we're moving into 4 and 5. Here's the week again. We're reading straight through. There are no gaps here. Notice that on Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll be reading through Paul's interpretation of the Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac story, where he talks about Isaac as the child of promise and sees Christians then as also children of the promise and thus the true heirs of Abraham. If this sounds familiar to you for some reason, it's because it should. We read through another version of this exact same concept in Galatians 2. So what Paul's done here is he's found a good illustration, and he's simply recycling it for this letter to the Romans. Some of the material on Friday and Saturday should sound familiar since we're just wrapping up the Easter season. Some parts of the Christ our Passover that we use to open morning prayer during the season of Easter comes from these chapters. Chapter 6 in particular is on baptism. This is an important section for us. Paul talks about justification through faith, yes, but what chapter 6 does is it shows how Paul sees this working out in practical terms through the sacraments. We are justified through faith, but baptism is what makes this possible and accessible. So, if we do have a baptismal ecclesiology, and if baptism is a central thing for Episcopalians, then pay close attention to this line of argument that Paul is making here through chapter 5 and 6. And honestly, that's one of the hard things about reading Paul in little chunks, like we do in the daily office and in the Eucharist. Paul tends to have fairly long and lengthy arguments, so he's working with an argument here that he's developing over several chapters, right? So he started, he's picking up in chapter 3, and he's on a big narrative arc through chapter 6. And so as a result, it's easy to lose the thread. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, because I'm helping you retain the thread, what exactly it is that Paul is up to here. So, again, read through these consistently. Try and get a sense of what the whole narrative arc is. All right, moving on to our third reading now. We are, once again, reading straight through Matthew with no particular gaps. We're going to finish up a talking section, then we're going to move into the final passion prediction and Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It's hard to believe we're already this far into Matthew. All right, so chapter 9 has got some more material about children, but then leads into possessions pretty seriously. We have the story of the young man with many possessions. We hear Peter talking about what benefits accrue to those who have left all for the sake of Jesus. Again, despite what you might think, especially if you listen to modern Christians, Jesus and the early church talked a lot more about possessions than they did about sex. How we use our possession and who possesses who is a major topic for discussion in the New Testament. Then in chapter 20, it begins with a parable that we hear on Wednesday. Then we move into 3 interrelated bits. There's the third and final passion prediction. Then the mother of James and John, 2 apostles, ask for a favor. She asks that one may sit at his right hand and one may sit at his left when Jesus enters into his kingdom. Now, we as readers know where the story is going. We know about the cross between the 2 thieves. And indeed, there's sort of an irony missing from the story if we don't have this information. So the fact that this section is connected with the third passion prediction is intended to be ironic. We're supposed to know that this is actually a really dumb request. And we're supposed to wonder how it is that these people have been disciples for this long and they still don't get it. This point is hammered home with the end of 20, where 2 blind men need healing. Clearly, we've got some commentary here on the apostles themselves, who are lacking some vision. Again, this is one of those Matthean doublets that we see sometimes, where Mark has something happening to one person. In Matthew, it'll be happening to 2 people. There's not always a clear reason for it in Matthew's case. In this case, I think it's pretty clear. Matthew's making a rather pointed point about the disciples and their lack of complete understanding, even at this late stage in the gospel. Right, then after we have that, we move into 21 and the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So, those were our main readings for this week. Numbers, Romans, and Matthew. But we do have a feast to attend to as well. So, the Nativity of St. John the Baptist is usually going to fall somewhere in Proper 7. Proper 7 is tied to the Sunday closest to June 22nd. The Feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist falls on June 24th. Of course, in 2018, it fell on Sunday, and so it's transferred typically to the Monday. We've got 4 readings, 2 for the morning and 2 for the evening. Just as a note, if you're following along with Forward Day by Day and its readings, you won't see the ones here that we're talking about, because Forward Day by Day uses the Eucharistic readings, not the appointed daily office readings for the Sundays and holy days like this one. Also, one word on timing. You'll notice this says the Nativity of St. John the Baptist. This is different from the decollation, the removal of the head of St. John the Baptist, which we don't technically have as a holy day in the 79 Book of Common Prayer. Usually, saints' days or feasts around saints are their death date. So we celebrate their heavenly nativity when they're born into eternal life. In this case, this feast is a bit of an exception, and that's because it's not a normal sanctoral feast. Rather, this is a feast of the Incarnation, and it's technically tied into Christmas. So, back in the 1st century, the equinoxes and solstices were reckoned as falling on the 24th or 25th of their respective months, not 20th, 21st, 22nd as they are now. As a result, there's a correspondence between the feasts placed on those days. We have a set of feasts of incarnation that fall on equinoxes and solstices. So, March 25th is the Annunciation. Exactly 9 months later is Christmas, on December 25th. All right, so this means that the Annunciation is on the spring equinox. That's the day when the daylight hours and the nighttime hours are equal. And Christmas is on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and therefore it's the rebirth of the light, because the days will begin getting longer after that point. The Nativity of St. John falls on the classical summer solstice. It's the longest day of the year, and the point after which the length of days will diminish. So the light is going to decrease after Midsummer's Day until we get back to the winter solstice. Thus, it's only fitting that the reading from John at morning prayer is John telling the people, he must increase, but I must decrease. The other reading at morning prayer is from Malachi, as is the first reading at evening prayer. And this goes back to what we were talking about 2 weeks ago in the connection between John the Baptist and Elijah. That Elijah is the messenger who's going to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. In a similar way, John the Baptist is the forerunner of Jesus' incarnation and appearance. The final reading at evening prayer is Matthew 11, where Jesus answers John's question about who he is, and then speaks to his disciples more about John and their respective places in the kingdom. One final note here before we leave John the Baptist and his nativity. A few weeks ago, we had a Feast of the Visitation. So, in our Book of Common Prayer, the Feast of the Visitation falls on May 31st. But some of our ecumenical brothers and sisters don't celebrate it then. In particular, the Roman Catholic Church celebrates the Visitation on July 2nd. So there's no chance that it can interfere with the end of Easter and Pentecost and Corpus Christi and all that like it did this year. But there's one problem with that. The Visitation is when the pregnant Mary meets the pregnant Elizabeth and then sticks around to help her have the child. The temporal logic of the event is completely lost if the Visitation occurs after the Nativity of John the Baptist. So I think the Episcopal timing here is definitely the better one. The Visitation should occur before John the Baptist gets born, not after it. All right, that's all we have for this week. If you'd like to pray the daily office online, check out the St. Bede's Breviary at breviary.stbede'sproductions.com and stop by prayer.forwardmovement.org, where you can find the office and also the readings and reflections from Forward Day by Day. I'd like to give a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. Come join us there on Patreon, and if you want to know more about that Elijah and John the Baptist connection, there's a video that's for the Patreon subscribers. Don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube, give me a thumbs up, and let me know what you think of the show in the comments. See you next week.